guys, Coach Krause here. Today we've got a cool lesson for you on maneuvering in close range with the tactic of pivot and punch. All right, it's a way to get around to an advantageous position on your opponent in the close range. And I want you to think about, moves that happen in the close range are completely unique to things that happen at a boxing distance and almost require their own set of tactics and skills, almost like math. You know how the quantum world is so much different than the world of the big, and there has to be different ways of talking about it. All right. So like I said, in boxing, the world of the long range and the close range, you go about them differently. The way that you position your feet and the place you want to put yourself in. If I was at a boxing range of Amanda, like behind the jab or further, I'm going to use lateral movement to arc around my opponent and orbit them somewhat. But in the close range, I have to perform pivots of 90 degrees, preferably, to get around my opponent. Let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. So let's say Amanda and I, we're in close range, and again, what is close range? It's as close as it gets. I mean, we're like making physical contact, and there's no way I'm going to possibly get closer. So right here, this is a very courageous way to fight, because anything that I can do to my opponent, she can potentially do to me. But this maybe isn't the smartest way to fight. A smarter thing would be to get an advantageous position on her, where I'm in position to throw my punches, but leave her with no ability to strike me back with a counter, and I'll be basically throwing free punches at a time. So let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. I'm face to face with her. More accurately, I'm hip to hip with her. What I want to do is, I'm traveling to the right. I want to leave my lead foot in this position, have my right foot move first, pivot it around 90 degrees, and if you can see in the acute now, my opponent is left facing nobody, but I'm in a position to get off all of my shots before she could possibly turn and pivot and get back in front of me, all right? Now, if I want to go the other way, what I don't want to do is leave that lead foot that position like I did last time and pivot from here, because what's going to happen is I'm going to actually put her, on the side of me, and she's going to have that advantageous position that I was talking about. Well, that doesn't do me any good. So what I want to do is, when I want to go to the left, you got to remember back to those very basic rules of movement. If I want to go left, the first thing that happens is my left foot moves, so I'm going to step outside of her hip. That's my barometer of what I'm trying to clear, because that's where all our power is going to be, inside of her hip. So I step outside of the hip, set that foot, and now I perform that 90-degree pivot. And now I've accomplished my goal. I'm in position to throw shots, but my opponent is not in position to do anything. And in fact, worse than that, I know exactly what my opponent's going to do before she does it, because the only thing she could possibly do is turn and pivot and face me to start fighting again. So I get a chance to get a free shot or two off here, and then as she turns, I can get another shot off, or at least enact the next move. So I always be a step ahead of my opponent in that regard. All right, so let's go over those basics again. We're in close range, at minimum foot to foot, but like I said, more accurately, you're making physical contact with your opponent. I'm going to the right, so the first thing that happens is my right foot moves first, and I pivot 90 degrees to her. So now it's like I'm looking into her ear, and that's where I get my shots off. Let me give you some perspective. If I was going to throw a left hook at my opponent from this position, it would be landing on the side of my opponent's head. But after I perform the pivot, that same left hook would now be coming directly onto my opponent. Just to give you some perspective of what that 90 degrees looks like, all right? So like I said, I'll throw my hip out, I'll be 90 degrees here, maybe a body shot, maybe an uppercut. Back here going to the left, maybe it's a long straight right hand, maybe it's a long uppercut. The choice is mine, because I enacted this move. I was proactive about my choices, and because of that, I get to choose what I want to throw. And like I said, also, it's a free shot, meaning my opponent is not in position to counter me back. This doesn't mean that I'm always going to land. I can get this pivot off and start throwing a right hand, and maybe she can roll her shoulder and kind of maneuver herself away from it and not get hit. That's true. But like I said, what I don't need to worry about is a counter punch from her. So I can go big. I can go for a home run in this circumstance. All right, so we have a couple different drills that we do here in the gym pertaining to the pivot and punch technique. The first drill is what we call the 3-point pivot drill. And in this drill, we each get a chance to experiment with throwing punches in a position that all lie 90 degrees to each other. So I'll go first. Amanda's just gonna stay stationary. I'm in close range. First thing I'm gonna go is to the first position to the right, 90 degrees to where I'm standing. Practice a punch or two. Now I'm gonna go to that second position. That's right where I came from in the center. Practice a punch or two. Third position is 90 degrees to this on the left. Step out, clear the hip, enact the pivot, practice a punch or two. Now I'm done with my 3 positions. I'm gonna come back in the center, and Amanda's gonna go to that first position. Yeah. The second position right in front of me. And that third position to my side. Yeah. And then she comes back in the center. And now my turn again. Maybe bang, bang, pop, pop. Boom. Now her turn. Back in the center. And we would just keep switching back and forth like that. Notice we're not really hitting each other. We're just coming up with options of punches that we would throw in each one of these particular situations. And why wouldn't I throw a zillion shots at my opponent? Why wouldn't I do something like pivot and just start unloading combinations? Because that's not going to be realistic. Because this is what your opponent's going to do. Man, I want you to pivot to the side. Pivot to the side. Come on, girl, pivot to the side. That's what your opponent's going to do. They're not going to want you on the side of them lingering in that advantageous position. So eventually they're going to pivot with you. And that's going to happen pretty quick. It's going to happen in the blink of an eye. So you want to practice techniques that you get off before your opponent can come back in position in front of you, because that's exactly what they're going to do. So the second drill we have is designed to give you a chance to experiment with these punches and pivoting in more real time. So that first drill was somewhat in slow motion. Like I said, you were pulling your punch on your opponent. Now I give my fighters a chance to throw the shot in reality, all right? So one of the partners will be having a body shield, just staying stationary and bracing for impact. The other one's going to be in close range. And now fighter A, Maggie, is going to tell fighter B, Amanda, which direction to pivot, left or right. And depending on which direction she says, Amanda's going to pivot and throw a hard, real-time body shot into this punch shield. Thank you, ladies. So, a great way to add intensity to these drills and allow you to experiment with throwing these shots with, hey, let's face it, a little bit of violence on the end of it, which is necessity, all right? So those 2 drills are practiced in a stationary position, and that is a place where this tactic can be used and will be used a lot, but there's also instances in the ring where you use this technique versus a moving target, and I have a cool drill to help us with that also, all right? So come on over here to the heavy bag. So the heavy bag, it's set to the top, so it's somewhat of a pendulum. And we're going to use that to our advantage right now. Amanda, what she's going to do is she's going to pull the heavy bag back, hold it for a second, and let it go. Hold it for a second, and let it go. Amanda, will you just start doing that for me? Just start doing that. And then make sure you hold it for a second. So you see this thing is moving, and it's moving in a way that I can time it because she is holding it for that pause. And what I'm going to practice doing is, ha, 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 ha. Timing that movement and walking it into this technique of pivot and punch, simulating, an opponent being aggressive or trying to rush me is definitely one of the places that you end up using this technique. The tactic is pivot and punch. Strategically, where you're going to use this, as we've seen with a couple of these different drills, will be different depending on the tactics your opponent is employing against you. So I think the most common is you both are get your stance, kind of stationary, maybe tired a little bit later in the fight, and you're using each other for balance, and I can feel my opponent resting on me. Well, she's using me for her balance, which is a no-no, and because of that, I can give that pivot and punch, and you see she's gonna fall into that shot slightly. Now, I could be the one putting the pressure on, get your stance. I could be trying to bully, and then I enact that pivot and punch technique. So that's somewhat of that same concept in reverse, where I was the one putting on the pressure, and I'm the one that utilizes the tactic of pivot and punch. I can have my opponent get against the bag. Pinned against the rope, so let's pretend that this bag represents her in the corner. Get your hands up. And I kind of have her bullied in, right? And maybe what I do is, boom, I'm one way. Boom, boom, I'm the other way. You know, all of like a Ricky Hatton that used to employ tactics like this. So there are different strategic places that you will use this technique of pivoting and punching. What's important, what's key, is that you clear the hip. When I clear the hip, my opponent can now no longer hit me with their big, serious punches. Can Amanda hit me? Can she reach her arm across and hit me with an arm shot? Absolutely. So I wouldn't say that you're safe. And in fact, you're never safe in that ring, right? But she can't hit me with the real quality shots that I have to be afraid of. And she certainly can't get a good counter shot off on me when I'm in this advantageous position. I want you to remember at home that this position, if your fighter's worth a damn, is going to last all but a split second. So I want you to pivot with me. Because they're just going to do that. And then you're going to try to keep up with you. Bang! So what you need to learn how to do is time that shot to come in the act of them pivoting before they get in their own position, all right? So pivot and punch is the tactic, and the strategy of what you use it, well, hey, keep training, keep practicing, and you can come up with many ways, all right? Like and subscribe.